POI, prioritizing CO. Just do it through chat. Starting my speech in three, two, one. To be human is to consider, and to be a society is to care and to be empathetic. This narrative, by its concept, is a narrative that seeks closure. But when it is diluted throughout societal dissemination and discourse, it is intoxicated when it becomes packaged out through society. This applies when a couple breaks up and never asks for clarity to each other and never communicates, when a beggar asks for change, and when the cries of kids in Gaza get forgotten because of the simple words, you don't owe anyone anything. And when we go someone and all of the things that happen within the status quo. This is likely because when it is a narrative, the application is diluted and feeds onto the confirmation biases on how we get to use it however we like. Because it is uncontrollable and there is no holy book to determine what is the proper use of this narrative, anyone can use it whatever they want, and therefore there is a proper form of misuse, and we think it is toxic. This applies in cases of two things. A, how we view things around the world, societal issues, and this does not only impact the way we think about others, but also the way we behave on social accordings, on social issues, and the way we affect our surroundings. And B, this happens particularly when couples break up, when we use words like, I don't owe him an apology, I don't owe it to her to open up communication because it is their fault. This narrative, by its existence, pushes away any forms of communication and responsibility because it washes that and cleanses that all away, because as per the word of the motion, you don't owe anyone anything. We think this is the most intimate and closest application of the narrative, not necessarily bigger things that closing might bring up about corporations, reparations, and filial piety, because all other things are affected by externalities that is out of our control, that is nothing to do correlated with this narrative. Things like beliefs, religion, capitalism, history, treaty, and legal bindings. But there's no treaty and legal form of consequence for you to forget about other people. This is about society at its most intimate and most vulnerable state. But this one affects relationships and friendships and how we see others the most. It's the main driving force for our decision set by the people around you, and then you internalize it to yourself, shaping how you view the world. It's a reassurance mechanism to us being egoistic. We think it's toxic. Two, argumentation. First, how this gives closure and communication to people. Two, on a societal level, how this pushes us away from societal issues. First, argument about giving closure and communication to people. When a couple breaks up, this narrative isolates both parties and any initiative for them to communicate with one another, because we don't know what happens afterwards due to the fact that this is the first layer, by the way, barely any incentive of communication. And in a way, because it pushes both parties onto their own bubble biases of confirmation that it is not my fault, it is not my responsibility to give him closure as to why I break up with him, why I ghosted her on Tinder and things like that. The thing that is wrong with this on a deeper level is that we don't know what's wrong with us, and they don't know what's wrong with themselves. There is barely form of communication or self-correcting mechanism onto one another from one party to the other. This narrative instill that bubble bias and unfair. We think on a level of communication, it's very, very unfair for not give anyone closure, and it doesn't give anyone the help that they deserve. Second of all, on a bigger scale, this lessens the help that we give and extend to others, because this shapes a way we view our responsibilities and ourselves. We think this narrative gets rid of the last safeguard when we give someone assistance, because it dilutes any incentive for empathy to show up within our decision making. Because this way, this narrative pushes us the belief that helping someone or helping others is a hassle for us. This applies not only to from the most stretching and chabay simplest impacts like giving your classmates homework, but it's also about giving a homeless man's day in front of the park, like giving a homeless man like extra change, extra money, helping a kid out on the streets, like selling candy and things like that. On the simplest things, we barely refuse to help society because we resort to the easiest form of internalization. I don't owe anyone anything, and maybe it's their fault. They're put into that position. We think on that simple level, that's it. We don't help others. But once you think of this on a deeper level, when everyone internalizes this narrative, what will happen is that it puts everybody in an island and dilutes any form of societal cohesion. It makes a lonely, lonely society that puts everyone in their own boxes without any help. And this type of society that they built under opposition is a brutal and predatory society that does not help one another because there's barely any incentive to do so. Where the ones who are more genetic lottery privileged will help them, will help themselves, and the poorest of the poor don't have any incentive to get, don't have any form of capacity being piggybacked or helped by other people because we feel like the responsibility is washed away. And when we internalize this form of narrative, it's easy for us to pinpoint the blame on themselves as opposed to pointing that finger back at us. Before second argument, yeah.
Yeah, it
Oh,
seems like
oh.
helping others still have intrinsic utility benefits. I could still help other people because it makes me feel good and that gives me happiness. Why do I need this narrative to help other people?
Well, because help, like there is of course a form of calculus. Like I might get feel good about it, but it's more of a hassle for me to spend my uang jajan and stuff like that. But under our side, we push that away and tell you to yourself that I shouldn't be egoistic. I shouldn't just prioritize myself. I should prioritize other people. But you, Nail, reinforce that narrative, worsen societal behavior, and we think you encourage that, and on a deeper level, it affects the way society, like people behave, and this translates not only through society, socio-economic clashes, race, gender, and all the things like that become affected. And I'm sure Aaron will elaborate on that. Second is on societal level. This is more on of a bigger impact. It pushes away us from societal issues, pushes us away from our responsibilities, from the things like donating to care. Like it's basically my first argument, but on a like bigger scale in forms of donation to the people who are cross borders around us. And we think it is very important for us to give the people and give some of our time. But under their side, they use the excuse to be indifferent to news, to be neglective, and to do all of that. Regardless the result, I just want to say everyone in this room is amazing. I'm personally rooting for Warga Sulawesi though, and thank you, Aaron, for being such an amazing team.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now to the Leader of Opposition.
To check am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're.
Okay. Proper pronunciation. Just directly unmute yourself if you have any POI. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, I grew up in a conservative household where my parents will always told me that it's okay to always help others, even when you are struggling, even when you don't have anything in your pocket, for example, because as a human, you will always help others and you will always put others before yourself, right? This is the type of the narrative I grew up with that makes me feel like I have to be a people pleaser. That makes me feel like even though I come from a conservative society, that even though other people takes away my opportunities, that it's okay because it's for the matter of helping other people, right? This is the type of narrative that we want to counterbalance with the existence of the have this a savior complex. You don't always have to be a people pleaser because it's okay to actually care about what you do, especially when you come from conservative household, especially when you come from marginal communities, right? 2 points of responses before I move to my setups and arguments. Then firstly, DPM talks about this is a way to wash away clarity and forget other people. To respond for this, firstly, audience to be aware that in the current status quo, there already have existing narrative, right? You always have other people, you have to be a savior and etc. Meaning people will not suddenly be so cold and forget other people because it's already the norms of other people, right? I don't understand why the case is so worse under OG panels because exactly people already help other people in society, but the existence of this narrative is to counterbalance the idea, right? That it's okay if you also want to prioritize yourself, but before you prioritize other people, it's okay to always take opportunities before you give opportunities to other people, right? This is a kind of thing that we want to protect under OO. But secondly, talking about the idea of societal issues, I think that it's already bad that you assume this narrative is to be ignorant, because it's actually the opposite, right? We flip this panels. Exactly. This narrative is actually a way to help those marginal communities, right? The minority communities that live in conservative areas that always give out and give away to help others, right? These narratives makes them feel validated, and it protects these marginal communities, that it's actually okay if you want to be selfish for once, because those people that comes from majority, other people already take away your chances, like through historically, right? So even if you want to be selfish in this era, and that is okay, Penas, and this is the type of people that we want to protect by this by this narrative, right? But be then, even if it makes people ignorant, for example, I think that the ignorance that the people get from this the ignorance that people get from this narrative is the ignorance for those at these marginal communities, right? Not ignorance for that you will not help other people. You will not help other people, for example, because those other actors that are not like oppressed in society will always help each other people out. So this narrative is actually exists for those vulnerable actors in the side, right? But then two setups. Then firstly, I think that our framing is simple. The nuance of this narrative is simple, right? Is to protect those marginal communities that always help others but don't get the return. Marginal communities are always forced to do things for other people. Then this narrative acts as a counterbalance against then quote unquote responsibility that are a push to them, right? But secondly, I think that the BOP of this debate is simple. Which sides that can protect this marginal community, and which sides that gives clarity to people to always like prioritize themselves first, right? Before I move to my argument, I'll take the PI. OG.
Notice, judges, the society they are building is a society that gives help when it benefits themselves. But the biggest extension of help comes when you give not when you don't.
I think that from my I think that from I think that it's okay to give help when it actually benefits you, especially when you come from these marginal communities where you always have to take all the opportunities that you can get, right? It's okay to be selfish, panels. And I think that this is exactly why this is a counterbalance, right? Because you normalize people always have, even when they don't get nothing in return. But for this marginal communities, then all the opportunities that they can get, right? So that's that. I think that, okay, moving to my argument, talking about like burden on minorities, I think that throughout the history, people that comes from conservative households or community that have conservative view of religions are always given the responsibility to put others before themselves, because it's an act that you should do, and extra. This is harmful for three reasons. Firstly, these people already come from marginal parts of society that live in conservative areas, meaning they don't have enough privilege to live their life, right? But they are also forced to put others before themselves. This is why they are forced to always be selfless, when in reality they should put themselves first, right? They're always forced to like give away with the hat that it's okay for other people to take away your opportunities, because you have to be kind, for example, you have to be forgiving, and etc. This is bad, Panos. But secondly, the selfless acts makes them deprioritize themselves when you should live your life first before looking to what other people's needs, right? This is so normalized because, e.g., as Hispanics that lives in the US, for example, you are told to always give away your kindness, giving the homeless money, giving people the help when you're also struggling, when you could use your money for your children instead of giving it to others, right? When you could use your opportunities to live for job instead of like giving people for those jobs, because you don't owe anyone anything at the end anyway, right? But three, then I think that on government, these marginal communities will never find the way out, because they are too selfless and they are okay with putting others before themselves. This is why marginalized communities that live in these rural areas are trapped with that, right? There's a normalization, like, e.g., the way they teach the children that when you see someone struggling, you should help them first, because kindness will always come back to you. But that is not the case, because kindness that you gave will not always get returned. But regardless of that, you let your children to have the mindset you should always put others before themselves, right? That it's okay when people have wronged you, for example. That's okay that even if those people oppress you, but you still have to prioritize them at the end. But under our side, it's different, panels. Compared to OG, this narrative empowers these people. It creates a counterbalance. It gives people validation that it's okay to not put others before yourself, it's okay to prioritize what you need first before you prioritize other people, right? Because you don't owe anyone anything at the end. I think that even if at the end of the day, let's say that these people like become like that selfish at the end of the day, I think that that's okay, because I already told you society comes in spectrum. Those society that always will always have other people because they have like the money, for example, because they are not oppressed, for example, will always exist. But under OG panels, this type of society will never have the help, regardless, because of the narrative that you owe anyone anything under all those.
All right, thank you to the leader of opposition for that fine speech. Now to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, I'm so nervous. Pronouns they dan she her. POI, please just unmute yourself. While through chat is fine. Kaki gue kesemutan lah, okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When I was like stuck in such an emotionally abusive period of my life when I was a kid, the only thing that I hoped for, the only thing that I wanted was for somebody to at least care enough about me. Somebody, please come and save me. But nobody cared enough. Nobody took their time out of their lives to even like stop and think about what I was going through. And I had to crawl myself out of that. And I wish I had not needed to do that. Kindness is such a scarcity in the world nowadays that we needed a Superman movie to remind us to do something as simple as being kind to and to have like empathy for one another. I just want you guys to know that this narrative, at first, yes, it was born with good intentions, and yes, it was made to counterbalance the other kind of narrative of like people pleasing attitude. But you have to realize that in the current status quo, it has grown to be so much. It has grown to be so much more than that. Like at first, it was used for like these kind of menial things. Okay, you don't have to give your homework. You don't have to give your homework answer to the classmate. Or like you don't have to like answer your mother's calls every time she calls you out of your cleanliness. But notice how this narrative has been evolved when it has been like kind of spread through your friends or through your like people, like when you are like going through like a conflict with someone else and like you vent to your friend and your friend is like, oh no, you don't owe it to him to help him out. You don't owe it to him. You don't owe it to anybody. You don't have to care about that. Slowly yet surely it kind of normalizes this behavior where like we don't really need to extend this kind of empathy, or like we don't have to extend like care and like this basic love for one another. I think that like even I think that if opposition's case is like on how this is bad for marginalized communities, I think that it would be even worse for them, because when you are stuck in a position where you have nothing else, you have nothing to your name, you are desperate, there's nothing that you can do. What do you have? You have your community. And I think that everybody take for granted like how exhausting being in a community is. You want to be in a community, you have to be willing to be burdened, because that is what the people is for. You cannot expect everybody to help you without you wanting to extend that kind of same effort back, without like expectation for that somebody else to give back, right?
POI?
This narrative is the ones that save marginalized communities from oppression, because we care enough about one another and not so self-focused on our own self-preservation to help our people, to help those who are in the same kind of suffering as we are. This is the kind of narrative that actually divides communities apart, by the way. This is the kind of individualism in late stage capitalism that normalizes trampling over other people, that normalizes you discarding of your friends, you discarding of your like the people who are closest to you in the name of your own self-sanity, or like keeping your peace. This is just not it, guys. POI.
Per Bintang's POI to Zara, your case is still transactional because now I want to help others because they helped me first, because I owe them. That's transactional.
No. That's such a big misunderstanding. Our case is that you want to help people out of your own kindness and not because you want anybody else to like give back to you. You don't. That's your case. Don't try to flip it on us. Like I. Okay, here's the thing. Helping people is difficult. Helping people takes time. It requires you to stop whatever you are doing. It requires you to, you know, put aside your own self-preservation. And that is so difficult to do when in late-stage capitalism, you are pitted against one another. Everybody is always in a competition with one another. We lose sight of what we are actually here to do, right? We need this kind of reminder that, hey, you it is true, you don't owe anyone anything, but don't be a bitch about it. Don't like think that everything revolves around you. Don't be too selfish. So like I think it's just such an important reminder for us to have in this current status quo that like no matter what the situation is, you do need to have other people's feeling in mind. You do have to be kind to one another. You never know what someone else is going through. You don't owe anybody kindness, but at the very least, you owe somebody like basic manners. You owe somebody the time of your day. When somebody comes to ask you for help, you do somewhat owe it to them to like do something for them, right? This person must have like been in such a situation for them to like discard of whatever dignity that they have to ask somebody for help, to put themselves in front of you. And in opposition, you just feel like, oh, I don't owe anyone anything. This is not my problem. Things don't have to affect you for you to care. And this is the kind of narrative that justifies that. This is why we want to tell you that this can be a corrective mechanism. Humans' innate tendency in situations is to be selfish, and especially whenever they characterize to you, the kind of world that we live in incentivizes that, and actively so. You don't owe it anybody. You don't owe anything to your mother. You don't owe anything to like anybody. Yes, you don't owe it to your mother. You don't ask to be born, but you don't have the right to be so bitchy and just freeload on her for your entire life. This narrative is most likely going to be used by people who are looking for a justification for their shitty behavior. It's not gonna be used for the people who are actually kind and selfless at heart, because this kind of narrative is not going to be going through to them anyway. But the widespread use of this narrative in the status quo, as characterized by OG, is the kind of problem that we are trying to solve here. Like what happened to like helping each other out? Like when some I don't okay. I think this narrative like doesn't really apply to like you with your friends, or like okay, it does somewhat apply to a certain extent, but it applies to like how we perceive someone else who is new. How somebody you don't really know that well ask you for help. Cannot like when somebody who is not very close to you asks you for money, you are like kind of the automatic feeling is like, oh, maybe I shouldn't lend the money, or like I don't owe this person money, but like maybe you should help them out or something like that. I don't know. It's just so baffling to me that it is not in people's minds that like you have to help other people out, and like this narrative just justifies that kind of behavior, and like this whole it's just a bad feeling, guys. Very proud to wait, no, yeah, very proud to speak in government.
All right, I think the speech from the Deputy Prime Minister. Next up, we are going with the Deputy Leader of Opposition to deliver their speech.
Okay, check. Am I audible and visible to all of the judges?
Yes, you're clear.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, just repeating what Bitang says on Sulawesi being great. Yay. Okay, all right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2. Oh yeah, a POI, a preference for herbal. I wouldn't be looking at the chat. 3, 2, 1. The everlasting strategic sin of every narrative debate that I've ever heard is to assume that the internalization of the narrative only happens automatically and in face value. I find DPM's analysis quite weird, because if I feel like I need to help to be kind through being kind, altruistic, why do I need the narrative to for me to owe them? I can just help them without feeling to owe them. Like, okay, sure. I hope you understand that. I think the fear that the phrase that you don't owe anyone anything will be taken to an extreme extent, like OG says, is very unlikely, because the fact that human beings have natural psychological cultural check and balances against toxic self-centeredness for 3 reasons. One, through biological wiring, humans evolved as social beings who depend on cooperation to survive. Through evolutions, we are hardwired to feel empathy, gratitude, and urge to help others, especially those who have helped us before. Second, this biological inclination works as a natural check and balance. So even when you are exposed to this narrative, there's a competition within your own psyche and internalization, because most people will still feel compelled to assist and appreciate others. Second, there are huge emotional attachment to people who already help you because of the intrinsic building of trust and friendship. One, people tend to form strong emotional bonds with those who have supported them before, particularly things like family members, close friends, and community figures. Second, this attachment creates an internal pressure to give back, even without the external narrative that OG wants to defend, right? Thirdly, I think there's a lifelong socialization into sacrificing yourself. From childhood, people are taught that the value of self-sacrifice is an absolute good. Second, these are rooted to you through things like religion, through education, and are habituated throughout your childhood. In fact, the timing when this narrative usually appears, i.e. the narrative of you don't owe anyone anything, appears and internalized typically in late adolescence or adulthood, because that's only a time you're quite independent in the degree of narratives that you want to absorb. Because oftentimes in your childhood, the narrative that you're absorbing are quite dependent on what your parents are teaching you. So in our side of the house, there are much more nuance to the pre-existing moral framework that you have internalized in our side of the house. This responds OG on the delusion of empathy and not wanting to help others. I would argue that you are still quite hardwired and are shaped to be altruistic by your biological tendencies. But more on that, even if people here you don't owe anyone anything, they still have strong utility utility reasons to help others. 3 reasons. One, helping others oftentimes makes people feel happy and proud. This happens intrinsically. It is not only about getting something in return, but about the warm emotional reward that comes from knowing you made a positive difference in people's life. But often, utility isn't just necessary happiness, because oftentimes there are these interactions at its initial form tends to be mutually beneficial. If I help Bintang organize a spar in this puntandum, I essentially helping him, not because I owe him making a spar, because a spar by itself also helps me to utility of improving my debate skills. No, thank you. This means that without an obligation, people will still help because it feels good. It strengthens your social bonds as well. This flips Bintang's POI to Zara. It is in their side that people are fully transactional, and people can be somewhat altruistic because kindness is internalized as intuitively good. So you already have built-in mechanism to internalize this narrative properly because it doesn't exist in isolation. There's a response to OG in its entirety, specifically on the idea of misuse and toxic manifestation. Because on top of the 3 things that I helped you earlier, the more important form of nuance is the fact that this narrative arrives in order to counterbalance the conservative values that my previous member tells you. OG tries to take away this from the debate by saying that, this is something that you cannot control and out of the debate. This happens in Bintang. This is not true because on the simple way that social narratives always behave through market behavior and have competitive tendencies across one another. Because as you grow up, you are exposed to different narratives, and this narrative actively tries to take a role and tries to be internalized as well. So they kind of compete in terms of urgency and tendencies. And oftentimes, what gets spewed out in terms of your personality is the manifestation and the construction of these narratives altogether. So what happens inside government is that the conservative values that we're trying so hard to counterbalance manifest in isolation and without any countervailing narratives that tries to dilute it. This is an important nuance here, because I think OG simply says that collectivization and individualism a debate. That's it. I don't think that's the case. The chronological nuance of opening opposition is to prove to you why people have been forced to absorb conservative values, and it is in our side that we unlock and tries to dilute the way in which people sacrifice in a toxic way. That's toxic way that happens on the side of the house. But before I continue, I'll take that POI from Ari.
Would it kill you to help somebody else on the street?
Yes, if I have to help them by killing myself. Like there are other ways in which I can help them, right? So what happens on God is that the extent of sacrifice that is being seen also to the things that are not directed to the actual help that was previously done. This is important to extend the nuance of Zara's case. That is to say, oftentimes parents, when you tell your parents, for example, you talk to your parents and you say that, Mom, I might be gay. But then mom slap you in the face and tells you that you owe her everything in your life. So what happens here is that because the use of conservative values in isolation oftentimes demands sacrifice in its extreme purest form. It is in our side of the house of what it means to sacrifice gets counterbalanced. In off, there's a likelihood of what it means to sacrifice yourself to help others are proportionate and objective in metrics because there are equal internalization of both the conservative value that I tell you and the you don't own narrative that exists and are internalized and processed symmetrically equal. So people still build relations, help one another, but the way in which you sacrifice yourself doesn't necessarily create too much trade-off to your own self. Why is this nuance quite debate winning? One, social narratives works chronologically. I mentioned it, and I think OG misses this, and I think this doesn't get weaponized too much in a lot of narrative debates. The world, through its conservative values, already happens on either side of the house. On OG, it continues to trap you in isolation, and there are no competing narratives. In our side of the house, there are competing narratives, and people can internalize that as well. It's the motion on our side of the house that unlocks the prison in which traps you to sacrifice yourself forever. Second, OG often imagines that you don't own narrative message to stop people from helping in the first place. But that is a procedural mistake in how you understand the motion. The narrative operates after someone has already helped you. It addresses the question of whether or not you must repay them or remain indebted forever in an extreme case. It does not prevent the initial act of kindness or helping others because the choice to help comes before the idea of owing someone becomes relevant in practice. Someone may still help another person simply because they want to or because of their utility. Then later the narrative operates itself and protect people from being forced into an asymmetric form of repayment. We win on OG because OG kind of says that this will be extreme. We prove to you this will not be extreme, and this actually counterbalances the most extreme pernicious form of sacrifice that government bench will defend. For all these reasons, proud to oppose. Here.
All right, thank you to the Deputy Leader of Opposition and opening team for the fine speech. Now going to the closing team, starting with government member.
Check, am I audible?
Yes.
Right. For POI, feel free to just drop it in the chat box or raise hand. Hope you can accept one from opening. Give me a second, setting up my timer. Okay, so I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. OG actually did a very great job in showing that this narrative makes human more selfish in general, harming minority and etc. But CG will show the deepest and most irreplaceable harm is not those macro impacts, but the destruction of closest support system. This is uniquely irreplaceable because they cannot be replicated by institutions or any strangers you can possibly get. But secondly, is regarding the internal perception of narratives, how it's gonna implicate to how people perceive this narrative internally, which is something unique because it doesn't correlate with any external acceptance. But the first piece of contextualization I want to give is regarding when do people usually think of this narrative? Obviously, when they face hardships, right? When they are in a they cannot decide on what should they prioritize, or when they start to question will they have support system or not. So this is the time that are very valuable for those amount of people, and I think that this context becomes important because it correlates to why this narrative becomes important specifically. But secondly, how does this narrative take place in society? Firstly, that it rejects any coerced obligation that makes you prioritize yourself first. I think OG did a great job in manifesting this. But secondly, it goes to an extent of making all interpersonal obligation as optional and something that is not mandatory, for example. So the implication is that every single relationship becomes purely transactional on yourself, the house. Your worth as an individual being measured by what you voluntarily choose to give and not the inherent feelings or the inherent closeness or roles that you inhabit. But because I want to argue to you that many relations or many interpersonal context in which one individual and another are based on role-based trust. How does it look like? It looks like friends loyalty or romantic partners or child and parents relationship. Such relationships are deeply bonded based on role and not solely based on transaction. On their side of the house, such relationship will be purely transactional. You'll evaluate each other's worth through the visible contribution they make to you and vice versa. For example, when you stop giving, like giving your time, giving your support, and etc., your value will drop. But the most important contribution from CG is how you internally contextualize this narrative because it makes you constantly uncomfortable in a relationship because you feel like you owe someone else, or you other people owe you more, for example. The life is dynamic. Sometimes you can give more, but in other instances you cannot possibly give anything because, like, especially when you're in your lowest low, for example, you will feel that your partner or your family might leave you exactly because of this constant insecurity that you feel. The context that humans always have pessimistic nature. They perceive themselves as less than they actually are. Hence, this kind of insecure narrative are very, very prominent, or insecure feelings are very prominent in most scenarios, which means the most important impact that is unique from CG is to make you feel insecure that your support system might leave you as they do not owe you anything when you're at your lowest low. Why is this in the penalty beginning? Because firstly, you can
POI?
never feel secure in any relationship that you try to construct, be it with your family, be it your friends, and etc. But secondly, every single relationship you make becomes shallow and transactional, where you cannot find meaningful relationship behind that. And the thing that is the biggest harm that they need to defend is a world where there is no such concept of unconditional acceptance. Why is this harmful? Because number one, I think unconditional is acceptance is important, noticing that the world is very harsh. People need space where they know that their worth will not be questioned just because they're in their lowest low. Every single day you go to your office, you meet your friends, you are constantly pushed to like express your self-worth based on performing at the highest level. The bare minimum you need is when you go back to your home, finding your family or finding your partner, they will accept you regardless of how much you did in that specific day. This kind of acceptance are important so that you can still find some sort of sanity as a human being, because I think obviously human needs a safe space. Human needs rest, and this can only come from an unconditional acceptance. But secondly, this is the prerequisite of you to recover from any failure or harm in life. Because I want to pose it to you that when you face a failure or harm, the incentive to fix all of this issue cannot come from other individuals, right? It should come from your own awareness. But the moment of you find that realization can only exist when you are comfortable enough in life. In a position where you're constantly challenged to always give the to always be transactional, to compare what you give with what your partner have given to you, if this allows you to be comfortable in that position, if this allows you to figure out what's wrong in your life, for example, and like eventually having the insight to change all of those things. But lastly, this argument run absent externalities, be it acceptance from other individuals or such things, because it's about how you as an individual perceive the narrative. So I think that at the end of the day, this is exactly why the specific contextualization on specific actors makes it unique in posing government. I'm going to take the PR from opening position.
Yeah, I give you three structural reasons why people are still likely to build relations and help one another. Why the social narrative works specifically and exclusively beyond those things,
Yeah,
those things that I just mentioned.
I'm gonna engage to this in my second part of my speech. But I think the at best, what's gonna exist in their side are that people gonna help each other for personal motive, for their personal benefit, like what they've pictured before. But I do not think this is enough because like the inherent uniqueness of like environment that allows you to grow exponentially as an individual is when you are able to feel comfortable with your own self. Secondly, like I'm gonna answer their POI about how we, for example, the narrative and how about the mechanism they provide to you and whatsoever. But I think the incentive to be individualistic is actually prominent in status quo, right? Especially with the constant need to for you to prove in office, to constantly to the constant need for you to prove your worth to your like professional level and whatsoever. I think it becomes extremely hard for you to always suddenly wanting to help other individuals. But secondly, and more importantly, I think the concept of you becoming helpless is going to be very, very conditional to each other, because I think people exist in spectrums, right? Not everyone think to do that kind of thing. At best, their mechanism works from some spectrum of individual, but there's going to be a some level of judgment to people who do it, because like they there is a difference of view and whatsoever, which makes it less compelling for other individuals to do such things anyway, because like they're gonna perceive as just wasting their time, wasting their energy and whatsoever. So I think that social judgment becomes an important factor right here as to why they will be disincentivized to do all of these things. But lastly, regarding professional level, I think that the toxic behavior in many offices will also becomes more prominent on their side of the house, because the constant need to prove your worth becomes exponentially larger. Because I think that in the current status quo, there are many progress into many companies trying to yourself feel comfortable regardless of maybe you becoming less productive in 1 month or another, but they will try to make you feel more comfortable because they understand a creative idea could only exist when you feel like are respected or like you feel comfortable enough. On the rest of those people will not understand such concept, and people will just try to be more to solve these things as soon as possible so that it can be transactional in the most easiest way.
All right. Thank you to member of government for that fine speech. Now to member of opposition. Here.
Check. Am I visible and audible, Kak?
Yes, you are.
Okay. POI through chat. I'll try to stop. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judge, this debate, it's not about whether people should be more kind or more evil. It's about the narrative itself. For Goff to win, they can't say just kindness is a good, and without it, people become selfish. They must show a counter narrative that replaces the current one. Remember, this is a narrative motions, and then you need to prove that this is the new stories, what actually makes people behave well. That's a massive burden. They need to explain like what people will believe instead of how it spreads and how it works better than the kindness narrative, right? But Goff never take this step, skipping the logical leap between the removing the narrative and people becoming better. Without this link, they are just hoping goodness happens in a vacuum, which is both unrealistically and unproven. That is why OG idealized version of kindness sounds noble, but in reality, when helping others become an unquestioned moral duty, it creates a fertile ground for exploitation. People start to expect that not appreciate your help. Those with bad intention learn they can take like advantage of your generosity without ever giving you back, for example. This is even worse when their DPM say that they don't expect they don't expect back from this help. Even this makes it even worse because this kindness at all cost story that OG pushes, the more blind you become to the manipulation, you stop noticing the takers because the narrative tells you, it's wrong to even question them until you drain, use, and left wondering why no one was there when you needed the help. Even with the moral coercions, structural mechanism ensure helps like still flows, for example, like taxation fund welfare programs will be still in there. Politicians still support that donation and community project to secure the voter trust, or even CSR initiative to protect the brand image. On top of that, individuals still engage in acts of like kindness because they want to, not because they're guilt into it, making this more like genuine and sustainable. In fact, the removing that you own narrative encourage voluntary generosity, which often creates like more effective and empathic support than the reluctant complaints in their sub the house. Or CG. CG then wants you to chain to this kindness narrative so no one, especially your loved ones, ever leaves you. That's not compassion. We think that's emotional blackmail, Judge. It robs you of the ability to draw the line and tell people enough, no matter how close you are. Real relationship has boundaries, right? Without them, I think you're not being kind, you're just being exploited. In CEO's world, we protect agency above all. You decide when you to give and when you to stop, because love without the freedom to say it's not love, it's a control. So under CO, within the narrative, you don't owe anything is emerge as a reaction to societal and cultural pressures that often impose unchosen obligations or on individuals, right? This is not brought by OO. So because people, especially those in marginalized burden with expectations from the family, community, or authority figures that dictate how we should to live, how we should to work or give, regardless of their consent or capacity. Under CO, we're gonna design this as a shield against exploitation, particularly in environments where gratitude and duty are weaponized during this narration in status quo. So this is just gonna be principally right, but also technically good for humans. How's the CO set up? We believe the moral obligations should only arise under two clear conditions. One, when your actions is directly harms another person, or when you have voluntarily committed to a responsibility. Outside of this situation, any claim that is not a moral it's not a moral truth, but it's a subjective expectation. Two, rejecting the narrative that you don't owe anyone anything opens the door for others to unilaterally decided when you supposedly owe them, for example, or granting them a moral authority over your life without your consent. This is not only undermines personal autonomy, but also creates danger power imbalance where those with the greater social influence can impose obligations on the vulnerable, for example, trapping them in the cycle of guilt and then exploitations. Even if OG and CG explained that this sounds good because it creating a happy family lives or whatsoever, like what CG said, this is still bad because one, the moment owing becomes a more expectations rather than a voluntary choice, it opened the door for guilt tripping or even a manipulation and policing of personal life decisions. Second, people may comply to maintain in harmony, but the compliance often comes at the cost of autonomy and the ability to pursue self-defined goals, for example, because we think happiness under those conditions can be conditional and fragile, depending on the continue to meet others' demands, for example. So judge understand that it's exactly for authoritative figures to take advantage once owing becomes a moral expectations because of like a few fundamental reasons. One, psychological leverage. For example, when society frames as help as a creating a moral debt, they gain a soft power over the recipient. The recipient feels like, oh, I owe you something, even if the repayment is never explicitly stated. Or second, unlike like financial debt, for example, more debts have no clear endpoint. These create like ambiguity of repayment. Third, if the recipient pushes you back, the benefactor can weaponize guilt and public perceptions. Like, oh, after what I've done for you, it's making you feel society costly, for example. Or last, in culture or system where authority respected or feared, leaders can use this framing to normalize obedience, making people believe that morally all compliance, loyalty, or silence is in exchange of the past benefit. This means that turning owing into a moral norm doesn't just raise personal needs, it structurally empowers those at authority to shape decisions, behaviors, or even the values of their for their own lives, for example. Second layer is the selfishness. In a world where minorities, marginalized groups are, already fighting uphill the battles, selfishness, I think it's still good. It's not a great, it's a survival. These are people constantly told to sacrifice the majority to be bigger person, for example, to give, even when it drains them to dry, for example, demanding they owe more is just code for exploiting them further. For some saying no, it's the only shot they have against a system that will take everything if they let it. If you strip away the right to be selfish, you're not building a kinder society. You are chaining the most vulnerable to the endless demands of with the more power. So in our world, people will leave the genuine autonomy while still building the connections. Proud.
All right, thank you to member of opposition for that fine speech. Now to government whip.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, hold on. Let me set my timer. Oh, also, if there's any connection problem from my side, just let me know. POI is on mute. Oh yeah, trigger warning just in case I say something triggering. Not my intention for the debate. Yeah, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think let's deal with CO first. The pointing out the technicalities of debate, like counter narrative. Understand that this is not a regret motion. Therefore, we don't have to offer you an alternative. You're not going to win based on lack of counter narrative based on golf, right? But also, let's talk about what they've brought so far regarding emotional blackmail, about emotional manipulation, shielding and exploitation. All of these things are similar to what we've heard in OO. So we think that at best, it's very derivative. So I think the rebuttals can go for both ways, right? But firstly, on their most unique contribution regarding welfare programs, I think first, welfare programs exist because policymakers think that I owe something for fellow citizens, even if it's like pragmatic so that they can get re-elected, so on and so forth. That principle still exists. This is far worse on their side because politicians don't have such incentive anymore. Fundings are going to be cut. Welfare becomes less accessible and generous because the core principle of state, which is to serve you something, to provide you something, owing you something, is then gone. So we said that state welfare is the last safety net that people need. We already flipped their case. But then on emotional blackmail and loss of boundaries, I think this also correlates to the conservative argument from OO. I question how you have boundaries when you don't owe anyone anything. You don't owe your partner consent to have sex even though they're very, very tired and don't want you to be near them, right? We say that if you don't own anything, you demand for unconditional love where everyone has to fit everyone's terms, therefore anything is okay. We question then how exploitation is not going to happen under your safety house. We say that A is based on hypocrisy because you will still expect someone to owe you something, even if it's basic decency. You expect not to be guilt-tripped by your partner, but you will still hold that exploitation against them because in a relationship, whether it be romantic, parental, or platonic, there is always something to be fulfilled. There's a reason why men are still downloading Grindr, even though the dating pool is near hopeless. And I think, secondly, if your family is that toxic, guilt trip will always exist anyway on your side. For example, if you say no, you'll be guilt tripped by what they have given to you later. Toxic families will always find a way to manipulate you. Let's break the deadlock here. A, even if you block yourself from emotional manipulation, the emotional pedestal that you don't owe anyone anything is more likely to cause you to exploit others. Therefore, you're just outsourcing the manipulation. But I think this should also be weighed with our contribution regarding constant insecurity, that it doesn't have to do with external acceptance, like your family or partner being good or bad, but the insecurity will be prominent and close yourself from making meaningful relationship. This is the only certain contribution in this debate and why we're up above OG. But let's move on to what OO has told you. I think the main thing is that they rely on competing narrative that will exist, but they never explain to you what that looks like. We give you a better metric that the competing narrative is when you weigh these options with the same narrative instead, right? First thing about the internalization is not that automatic to happen, that like people still help because of social instinct. I think in Ooga Booga era, sure, maybe you cannot survive alone, therefore we agree. But they forget the status quo nuance where it's already so isolated and with the current psychological development. For example, through evolution, you only get the traits that you urgently need. Or even in positive psychology, where you test out your personal strengths every year and your top 5 will fluctuate based on what you require that year. Therefore, you require most self-preservation in this economy compared to socializing. Therefore, the intrinsic need to help becomes less urgent because for you to keep going is exactly to detach from conservative values, for example, is to have a heart made of steel and keep walking forward. With this, we proved that the inherent instinct does not exist. Therefore, it's less likely to still want to help, even for pragmatic reasons that they will help you back. But let's flip. Even if it still exists, we said that it's not that automatic to happen either under their side, because the outcome of your emotional processing is contingent on others' input towards you. Meaning that even if you tell yourself that you don't owe anyone anything, you still seek external validation to be able to use the very narrative that you rely on, right? So that case is like clear out of debate. But then secondly, talking about people pleaser and conservative values. Let's face the hypocrisy we tell ourselves. You are a people pleaser because you can sleep well at night knowing that you're a good person. So you can step out of situations thinking that I did everything I can to help them. Therefore, if I am at a strategic place to victimize myself when I am held accountable or confronted at, I'm willing to trade off resources and my discomfort so that I will not be exposed for the fraud that I am. My incapabilities are born out of what I tell myself are variables out of my control and are contingent on others. And I think opposition bench also forget how people think, right? I think the narrative to owe is not one-dimensional towards your mom only, but you also owe yourself the clarification and the fresh air that comes with coming out. Owing your mother her standards on a silver platter that runs out the moment she dies in 20 years, way less than owing yourself the justice in acknowledging yourself that you're allowed to live without conforming to heteronormative society, that owing yourself internal validation, that your love to your mom doesn't decrease anymore compared to your love for other girls, for example. And then secondly, I think freedom does not come at the expense of sacrificing others for you to thrive as a lone star, because that is a hypocrisy you will always demand from others as well without wanting to be subject to it yourself, exactly because of self-preservation. Lord bless your mother for being homophobic towards you because she thinks it will harm you, not because of the sexuality itself, but pushing the burden that you don't owe anything to your mom still requires you to having your mom owing you acceptance. Therefore, we provide you the moderate place in the spectrum where you meet in the middle, and it can only be done when you propose your wants equally. That bite the bullet that it's going to be transactional, because the alternative is much worse, where it's much more unclear, and you cut down ties and you end up having to owe yourself the very social life that OO wants, and there is no way of fulfilling it because what you've lost is the most meaningful one in your your life in the grand scheme of things, right? But then let's also engage with their marginal communities thing, right? A, simply not true, because the fight for justice is inherently selfish. The backbone of marginal communities to keep going and not just give up and give all their land away for the government to exploit is that they owe their ancestors, they owe their tradition, owe the environment which has shaped them to foster this emotional attachment to keep going. It's deeper than that. You also owe yourself the strength and discipline and proof that your identity is not invalid. Therefore, secondly, not owing anything doesn't mean that you don't owe anything. You don't owe the perfect victim image, but you owe the devotion or dedication for the hard, treacherous fight. That's the only vessel for you to have equal opportunities. What you owe internally is more important than whatever you owe externally. Let's bring like the Raja Ampat example, right? This is where the unconditional love extension under Danish is the most important contribution in this debate. Because the reason for you to fight Bahlil and risk your life is inherently the manifestation of you owing yourself this attempt to victory. The way here is that we're going to be completely charitable, that the only way for you to survive is because you can be as reckless as possible to commit a lone wolf mission and not back down to oppression. But your hopeful outcome is going to be eroded gradually but surely to the point you don't even owe yourself to see the fight go out. You lose your sense of identity, you lose yourself. The harm doesn't just stop in the unsustainability of your community livelihood or whatever community like benefit that OG tries to bring, but extends into crushing your soul, owing yourself to live no longer exists. Therefore, it's going to be far, far more destructive, right? And I think the fact that people sometimes spiral after reflecting that even when trying to be grateful, they're convoluted in their own head and obsessed with themselves, they also realize that they owe themselves the success of getting out of that rabbit hole, right? That if they did not demand of themselves of doing that, like, for example, for me, I will not be in Grand Final and instead in a psych ward, right? So I think the extension to like trickle down to self-destruction is inevitable because even if you end up happier as you go by your own terms will also continue to regress as you achieve lower and lower rock bottom moments. Therefore, the moments for you to get a break and like relieve yourself is going to be so far harder under the 7th house because you also allow yourself to lower that standard that apparently is intrinsic. My timer stopped. I'm gonna stop. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that amazing speech, Government Whip. But remember that the time is 7:20 at max. I will not write anything. So yeah. The last speaker of this grand final, please welcome the opposition whip to close the debate.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, let me just turn on my camera. Okay. Okay, am I audible and visible? Okay. I'll take my POI preference is just unmute yourself because I will not be looking at the chat. And I'll take a POI around 5. So yeah, if you offer one before, I'll just say later. Okay. This is a very, I would say, yeah, sensitive motion. So bit disclaimer. Hopefully I'm not gonna say anything triggering. It's not my intention if that happens. Okay. Okay. Bit nervous. Starting my in 3, 2, 1. One important clarification before I move on. Judge, understand that the government's entire case rests on proving a specific chain that opposing the narrative you don't owe anyone anything, that will actually cause people to be kinder and more willing to help each other. So their side, it's not just about proving kindness is good. They must show a sebab akibat, a causal shift in human behavior. So they need to explain a lot of things. First, they never explain to us how they are going to oppose. They never explain how the action of opposing actually works. And that will lead to people changing their behavior because narrative is an external factor of humanity. And so they can't just win the debate on saying why kindness is good, right? They didn't meet every step of their burden, so their impacts never materialize. OG is out of the debate entirely. So I want to talk about CG first and then OG before I move on to comparative. let's talk about CG, right? Because they talk, their contribution first is that from Danish, oh, people feel insecure about their life, so they need a safety net to lean back on, and they will go insane in ours. A few responses to this. In opposition's world, the narrative of you don't owe anyone anything, when we support it, uh, it removes actually the expectation that your safety net must come from your family or friends. This pushes people to plan ahead for emergencies because they know they cannot simply rely on moral obligation from others. They invest in personal buffers like savings, insurance, emergency funds. So this creates true mental stability. You're secure because you're prepared, not because you're hoping someone will rescue you. So, but okay, even if emotional safety drops, why it is a healthier trade-off? The you don't owe anyone anything in narrative in op may reduce the emotional comfort, but it prevents the hidden cost of conditional support, like what Zio said. In government, when help is given with the expectation of obedience, manipulation becomes normalized. So why self-reliance is actually crucial in the real world, right? Which you get under op. Because there's a lot of unstable relationship. Families break apart due to divorce, generational disputes, or migration, and even close friends can fade over time, even without having an argument, but just because of distance or career moves or life changes. So if your safety net is built solely on personal obligation, it collapses when those ties are weakened, right? But this becomes more important in personal relationships because I would argue that negotiation is better without desperation. Because the best relationships, whether with family, friends, or at work, it happens best when both know they're okay on their own, that they're not in survival mode. Because if one person is more desperate, they cannot really say no to unfair requests. And the other person who is more stable, they know the other person in front of them is they have an advantage that they can take because there's a power imbalance. So that's not real agreement that you get under your side. You're just doing whatever it takes from keep the other person leaving. So this keeps people trapped in toxic relationship because they're afraid exactly the other person is going to leave. Now let's talk about OG then, right? When I'm going to be charitable to OG, why even if somehow you get people change, you skip the link, why I will explain why pure genuinely help is psychologically unstable. Because even in a world where government tries to build a culture of unconditional care, there's a lot of structural human psychological reasons. The first thing is evolutionary reciprocity bias, because humans evolved in a small interdependent groups where survival depended on the mutual aid with the expectation of return. Even in the modern context, our brains still fire the same way. We feel uneasy when a debt remains unpaid, even in modern context. So this bias means sustained help naturally shifts into expecting favors, obedience, or repayment, breaking government's premise of no strings attached. But there's also the issue of power asymmetry as a default social dynamic. Because in human history, controlling resources means controlling people. When one person is the gatekeeper to something another needs, dominance emerges even without conscious malice. Because once in control, the benefactor, the one who gives, instinctively work to maintain that advantage. Because losing it historically means losing survival security. So judges understand that humans, they fear losing more than they value gaining. So when someone invests significant help, money, or time to another person, they see the recipient's autonomy as a risk to their investment. This leads to ongoing control to protect the payoff, even if it harms the recipient's freedom. You see this on the issue of parents controlling their children, etc. So the impact for weighing is simple. These instincts are universal and subconscious. They appear in families, workplaces, politics, and aid organizations, etc. Right? But why does help still happen in opposition's world? Because OG is saying as if this doesn't happen. Even if people are more individualist, right? I will repeat what Ziu said. There are institutionalized incentives for giving. There are tax deduction and credits when companies donate to charity. This means that in an individualistic culture, people and corporations still want to give aid or donation because it directly reduces their tax liability. Altruism is replaced by strategic self-interest, but at least the money still flows under our side of the house, right? But there's also reputational incentives where public charity donations boost social image and brand trust, which directly translate to better sales, partnerships, or political capital. So that means that all of those things that you cared about is actually already safe under our side, right? But lastly, then, I forgot about this for CG because Whip of CG talked about, oh, the harm in opposition is that selfish people will exploit kind ones. I believe there are actually natural check and balances where kind individuals can choose to stop helping people once they realize they are exploitation. But this actually becomes better under our side because when you support the narrative under our side, people become more aware against freeloaders because they realize, I keep helping that person. That person is selfish. I should not help them anymore. So I think that is taken care of, right? So, Judge, how should you weigh this debate? I want to simplify it. Guff's best case is a world where people help each other more, but the trade-off is that this help can be corrupted into a tool of control and manipulation. In opposition's best case, people are free from this abuse, but the trade-off is that fewer people might help each other. We win because the harm in Guffs is more dangerous. Why so? First, on the scale of harm, government's trade-off is that the very help meant for the vulnerable becomes a tool for control and exploitation. Parents funding their child's education but demanding they choose a certain career. Bosses helping employees with financial crisis, then using that as a leverage to make them work overtime. Australia helping Papua New Guinea, but to inflict political strings. So these harms target the exact vulnerable groups that government wants to help. And also on the issue of reversibility, our side, you can reverse apathy by policy nudges. But in your side, the exploitation of kindness is much harder to fix because once someone has experienced kindness as manipulation, they are far more skeptical of all future help, even if it's genuine. So the weighing is much simple, very.
All right. Thank you so much to Opposition Whip for that fine speech. And congratulations to all the grand finalists for such an amazing debate and speeches.